Hi, I'm Angelica Clarke, and I'm in Albany, New York, and I'm a part of an organization called the Capital Area Against Mass Incarceration, and we've been organizing demonstrations since the non-indictment verdict in the Michael Brown case, which is in Ferguson, Missouri, where an officer shot and killed a young man, and his body was then left in the street for multiple hours, and that officer who killed him was not indicted. He was not given any fault whatsoever. So we had a demonstration here in Albany after that. About 400 people came out for that demonstration. We marched down the street. We came together and had a conversation outside of the federal building where we were talking about some of the federal needs around civil rights charges against that officer. Because he was not given any state charges or city charges for that crime. So trying to get the federal government to intervene out of Washington, to have the Attorney General's office intervene, which they have yet to do, and also to essentially force them to investigate into that incident in Ferguson, which again, they have an ongoing investigation, but there's been no outcome from that either. And after the non-indictment for another officer who in New York State killed a man named Eric Garner using an illegal chokehold, which essentially is like the New York Police Department has a practice that you can't put people in chokeholds. Eric Garner was put in a chokehold, and that resulted in his death because he had asthma. And that officer was also not indicted and received no fault, no charge, and he is now on paid administrative leave, which basically means he's getting paid right now after he's taken this man's life, and there's no punishment for that either. So we had a series of demonstrations since that time here in Albany. We had one on December 4th, which was a gathering outside of a police station in Albany, the Albany Police Department headquarters, and a couple hundred people gathered for that. We blocked the roadways. We had a few die-ins, demonstrations where people lay down and simulate that they're dead. And we had that in the demonstration outside of the entrance to the highway. And then we brought that again onto sort of a main street in Albany, Central Avenue, and a lot of folks were out for that, and a lot of young people have been participating in this movement here. People who have not really done any kind of demonstrating before have come out for this, I think, because it's becoming increasingly personal for people. The experience of police violence, which exists in essentially every city in the United States, but particularly in the cities that are heavily segregated, cities like Albany, New York City, places, essentially the entire Midwest of the United States. So these incidents are not just isolated to these few cases that we hear about. They actually happen every single day. And people are sort of beginning to notice and beginning to be tired of it. So we're seeing more people coming into the movement to end police violence and to end the prison system and a variety of different injustices that racially impact folks. So all across the country, we've seen demonstrations happening in cities where big demonstrations usually happen, but now it seems like the stakes for those have been raised. Cities like Oakland, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Missouri, which is where Ferguson is, a suburb of Ferguson, or rather Ferguson is a suburb of St. Louis. Cities like Houston, Austin, New York City, Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia. A lot of people across the country have been demonstrating and now have started to demonstrate in ways that take more risks, like in more radical ways. People have been shutting down bridges. In New York City, they shut down every single bridge repeatedly over the course of 3 or 4 nights after the non-indictment for Eric Garner, for the officer who murdered Eric Garner. They shut down every single bridge that day. They've shut down bridges every day since then. The same has been happening in all those cities that I mentioned before. What we're seeing, I think, is a change in people's attitude about how you demonstrate. I think that we had in the U.S., the Occupy movement kind of made people think of themselves as activists and as demonstrators in a way that they hadn't for a long time. Like a new generation of people started to demonstrate, and now I think we're seeing that people are more interested in disruption than they have ever been before. Which I think is an exciting change in the way that people come together here. because, you know, disruption and interrupting the sort of business as usual is one way that we can make our demonstrations more useful and actually help us get some of the things that we want to see. And the fact that people are organizing without organizations connected to them in a lot of these different cities. There are independent demonstrations coming up, and people in those independent demonstrations are doing things like shutting down bridges, shutting down highways. So it's not even requiring the kind of like institutional memory that you would typically need to do a demonstration like that, something that, you know, where it's something that you can be arrested for. But now we're seeing that people are just doing that without a second thought. Like, people are just coming together and going, oh, what are we doing today? Today we're shutting down the highway. Today we're shutting down this bridge. Today we're occupying this police station. So I think we're seeing a new sort of activism in across the U.S. that I think will continue, particularly around this issue, but perhaps even expanding into other areas. So in Ferguson, Missouri, the officer that killed the young man, Mike Brown, is one officer of many in that particular suburb, and something that I've seen there that I think is really interesting, and that has, in my opinion, like helped to grow this movement across the country, is that you see the racial disparity in that city in such a stark way. The city is, you know, over 70% black, and yet the entire police force is white. There are, I think, 4 officers of color, and the entire government of that city is also white. So you see the disenfranchisement of those people in a very systematic way happening in Ferguson, and that makes, for a lot of people, makes visible the systematic disenfranchisement that exists in their cities as well. To see a city that, you know, essentially all of their revenue from tickets and arrests, like sort of fines, those kinds of things, come from the black community, but yet the entire government is controlled by people who are upper middle or middle class and who are exclusively white. And that also is the case in a lot of other cities across the country, and also is the case in a lot of other states across the country, where we have such deep racial disparity, but that because it's become so normalized, people don't notice it. And the situation in Ferguson, I think, has made for a lot of people that disparity very visible. Like particularly just us here in upstate New York, you know, we have cities that are 80% white. And then you see the exact reverse for our arrest and conviction rates. You have 80% in the city of Albany, over 80% arrests are black or Latino, over 80% of convictions are black or Latino, and yet you have a city that is clearly majority not people of color. So I think that that we can use a moment like this to make those kinds of disparities visible. Particularly in the state of New York, this is the most unequal state economically in the entire country, partially because Wall Street is in this country and a lot of billionaires, in this state rather, and a lot of billionaires live in this state. So we have an extreme disparity of wealth. And this is the kind of moment, I think, a movement moment, where we can start to say these disparities are existing across racial lines, they exist across class lines, and it's, you know, and this is the moment that we can start to actually bring that to bear and start to find ways to move away from that disparity. Like, we can start to find ways to move away from systems that are disenfranchising us, systems that are built on, you know, sort of a history of racism in this country, both institutionally and interpersonally. When it comes to police, I think we see a lot of reform movements that come out that are specifically sort of targeting, you know, that, trying to address that segregation issue, like trying to bring more officers of color into the police force. And those kind of reform movements, to me, actually diminish our ability, right, to get to a more equal society, because really what you're doing is now you're just bringing people of color as agents of the state into systems of violence, right? So you're then making them agents of that violence, rather than saying, no, this institution is racist, right? Like the police force in the United States historically comes from slave patrols. They indentured servants and volunteers in the first 13 colonies came together to form slave patrols. Those slave patrols then transitioned into police forces, and those police forces now enact that racism today, right? Like, even though, right, technically the institution of slavery in the United States was abolished, it's still legal to enslave someone who has committed a felony, who is in possession of the state. That's in the Constitution. And people, I think, like, have forgotten those kinds of things. Like, you forget the history of the police force, you forget that the Constitution allows slavery, And I think we see a lot of news articles about private prisons and how private prisons are exploiting people's labor and how this is like very wrong. But really the private prison system in the United States is only 10% of the prisons. 90% of the prisons are not privatized, and they still torture people. They still steal people's labor and exploit them, and they still disenfranchise entire communities, particularly the Black community, but also the South Asian community, Latino community. These systems aren't existing in a vacuum, and I think a moment like this is one where we can really start to talk more honestly about the history of this country and about the segregation that exists in this country, and about how some of these reforms that are suggested really won't have any concrete impact because they don't address the structural racism that exists, or the structural classism that exists, or the structural sexism that exists. So without, to me, without an analysis that addresses all of those things and that works towards a total transformation of the system that we have right now and abolition of the police force, because they're, from my perspective, they cannot be redeemed. The system of prisons also, needs to be abolished, because that right now operates as a system to disenfranchise particular races of people in this country. We have the largest prison population in the world in the United States. 25% of the prisoners are in the United States, and we have something like 5% of the population of the world. And there are 2.3 million people in prison, 6 million people in the U.S. who are touched by either probation or parole, who were formerly incarcerated people. And in the U.S. that makes it legal in some states for them to not be allowed to vote ever again if they've been convicted of a felony. And like in New York State, you are not allowed to vote until you're off parole or probation, or off papers as people call it here. So these systems are not just operating in the moment, right? Like in the moment of, I'm a person who has violated this law. I've been surveilled in my community to the point where they have found me violating this law. And now for the remainder of my life, I'm going to be subject to institutional violence, structural violence. I won't be able to find a job. I won't be able to go to college because I've been connected to this system, which is meant to disenfranchise particular communities of people. So I think that this is a moment where we can really start to talk more about that and start to be, be creative and be proactive about transforming these systems that cannot really and do not really serve us.